Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. If you're joining us, we're about to start in about 3 minutes. So hold on tight. It is happening. I look forward to introducing properly. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a great pleasure to be here with you on Ramadan Live for my session. And just before we get into exploring the beautiful names of Allah in the Quran, I want to just tell you a bit about the college, Cambridge Muslim College. It's an independent institute of higher education, and we're a registered charity. The growth and success of our college relies on the generosity of our friends, patrons, and supporters from across the UK and beyond. So please help Cambridge Muslim College train future generations of Muslim scholars, thinkers, and leaders, and continue delivering education programs like Ramadan Live. You can help us continue our vital work through regular giving, become a friend or patron of the college. You can make one-off donations, whatever amount that you choose, and you can also pay your zakat to the college, directly benefiting students in need. With that said, please visit cambridgemuslimcollege.ac.uk, donate/donate, and donate today or later on in the month of mercy. Today I'm going to be setting the scene on what I'll be doing in the sessions to come, which is 4 sessions, I believe. What are we talking about? Are we going into that and also starting off our sessions? So what do we mean by the divine names or the beautiful names of Allah, al-Asma al-Husna? Well, first and foremost, and most importantly, we mean the names that we find in the Quran. These are often in pairs by which Allah names himself. Reading the Quran, as we do in Ramadan, and whether you read in, probably in Arabic, but also if you're using translation, perhaps, you come across these names and the meanings, and you have some idea of what that might be about. You hear that Allah is Ar-Rahman, and you might hear something like, you read something like the All-Merciful or the Most Gracious or some such, and you'll have some idea of what that means, of course. But I suspect that it could be a fairly vague sense, at least in theological terms. So in these sessions, I want to give more of a theological definition to these names and their relationship. That is, I want to explain what they mean from a theological angle. Explaining from a theological angle is not to negate other approaches to the divine names. Many scholars have been inspired by these names and have explored them in various ways in various types of books and texts and in different traditions within Islam, perhaps in specialized works or in theological tafsir. In my sessions, I will not be trying to cover every approach to these names and to understanding them. That would be way beyond what I could do in these short sessions together. But rather, I'll be turning to a master exegete and theologian and someone who I specialize in their thoughts, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who died in 333 or 944, depending on which calendar you use. And he gives his name to one of the main schools of Sunni Kalam or Sunni theology, the Maturidi school. And so we want to see today how he approached them. So this means that most of my focus will be on his large theological tafsir, Ta'wilat al-Qur'an. But before that, I want to set a theological context through his Kitab al-Tawheed, a comprehensive Kalam manual. So I'm actually going to start off with a bit of theological content. Hopefully, people won't be too drained from the day's fasting to appreciate the point here. But I think it does set an important context for what I'm going to say about the names. And then I'll be going on in sort of up to the half hour after setting this context, talking about the names that we always start with, of course, in the Basmala, Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, and explaining about the distinction there. So Al-Maturidi has a chapter about the divine names in his Kitab al-Tawheed, which is his theological manual, a masterful and lengthy work of theology. And he speaks about them in three ways. And so I want to draw some distinctions which will help us to think about these names theologically. The first way these names can come about is we're referring to our naming of God. So when these names are found within the Quran, or when we speak, for example, these names, there's a naming going on, which is something that we're doing, and we are, of course, creation. We are khalq. We are Allah's servants. So what we are saying when we are naming is not itself, in that sense, those names are not themselves eternal, because they're part of creation. So there's a naming action which he sees to be part of the created world. So just to give you a sense of what he says, he'll talk about, for example, the name Alim or Alim, right, which is Allah's being omniscient, as distinct from the name Qadir, omnipotent, right? And because these names are distinct, they cannot both be identified with God himself. So then there's a question of what's the status of these names. We can make a distinction here. When we say Allah, Allah is we say Allah is omnipotent or the omnipotent. When we're saying this, are we talking about this particular Arabic word, or are we talking about an underlying reality about Allah? And that's an important point. And so Maturidi's first point is sometimes we're just talking about our act of naming. We're just talking about an Arabic sentence or an English sentence that's letting us talk about God. And if that's the case, then that's just part of created speech. And so when we're talking in that level, we're not talking. We're talking about a name that's not itself referring to the sort of reality of God, but always referring to the reality, but it's not itself the reality, if that makes sense. It's just the word we're using or the expression we're using, which is relating something. Okay. And sometimes as well in this kind of category of things that are related to the names, but within the creation, you have something, for example, like the prayer, right? The prayer, salah, we might call the prayer God's command, Amrullah, right? Because God has commanded us to pray. But that doesn't mean that the prayer is something that's of God itself. It's part of the creation, but it's still God's command because it's associated with God. So this also comes into this category. Allah sometimes will attribute his own name to things. For example, the Kaaba is Baytullah, right? Or the she-camel of Allah in the time of Saleh. So you have these various applications of Allah's name, of course, to things in the creation as well. normally to honor these things. Okay, so now we want to go a bit beyond that. So the second point I want to make is to talk about um, these aspects of God that are related by, for example, God being omniscient and omnipotent. So we say Allah has ilm, knowledge, and He has qudra, power. So these names can refer back to attributes. So these attributes of Allah, His knowledge or His power, His mercy, mercifulness, these are not considered to be Him, according to Al-Maturidi, but they're also not other than Him in His complete unity. Because being other than Him in His complete unity would make them part of the creation, and they're not. Allah's knowledge is not part of the creation. So there is a kind of very subtle distinction, which we're not going to get into, which is dealt with in theology, about what is the exact status of these attributes vis-a-vis the divine nature or the divine essence or God Himself. But we're going to focus just on the names. But my point is that some of these names will refer back to these attributes. They will refer back to God's knowledge. So when you see the name Al-Alim, Allah is the all-knowing or the omniscient, the Maturidi's understanding of this is, well, that's referring to the fact that God has this attribute of ilm, of knowledge, or likewise with the idea of being qadir, being having or being in the Quran, maybe something like al-azim, mighty, could perhaps something we'll come across later, but will relate back to what? To God's power or to His other attributes that reflect those qualities. So now for al-Maturidi, we're also going to see that all of God's attributes are what he calls essential. This means that God always has them without change, and this also includes His actions. So not only are all the attributes of God something that He always possesses, but also all of the actions of God are eternally possessed, i.e., God, in a sense, exists completely outside of time and is engaged in everything that He does that is His nature, all at once, with the effects happening or the outcomes happening at their points in the time. So this is, again, gets into very deep waters theologically. How do you discuss God and time? But it's important for our discussion that we're aware that all these attributes are essential. There's nothing that God does not change in his attributes or in his qualities. He always possesses them. So this will mean, for Maturidi at least, that being Rahim, being merciful, as we'll come on to discuss, refers back to an action of mercifulness that is distinct from the created outcome of mercy in the world. So it's not just God's not just merciful because He's got the power to create mercy, but He's actually essentially merciful in a meaningful sense. And that can be explained in various ways, but it is important to Him. That's the type of action. And that action is an essential attribute for Maturidi. And then finally, the third category here is there are some names, such as Allah or Al-Wahid, the One, that don't refer to a particular distinct attribute of God, but they refer to His essence or essential nature. That is, God in His unity with all of His attributes. And so when we actually add Al in front of one of the names we were discussing that refer to qualities, so we could say, okay, that God is Rahim. And when we say God is Rahim, it refers to Him being merciful, which is an attribute. But when we say He is Ar-Rahim, the merciful, then we're actually referring to God. We're referring to the one who possesses that quality. So we're referring right back to the divine nature, referring back to God Himself. And so this name is, and some names only refer in this way. So we're going to have various types of names and various ways of expressing them. Some names that are fully given with al refer to God, but because of the nature of the meaning that comes from that name, like we said, Ar-Rahim, then we know that this refers to something about God. If Allah refers to God, then Ar-Rahim refers to God, but with the meaning of the fact that He's got this quality or attribute of mercy or mercifulness. So this is the way that Maturidi will kind of deal with the attribute with the names in the Quran and in his tafsir. And what's quite interesting here is that he doesn't give any kind of third position for the names. He doesn't give a kind of a sort of, you know, he doesn't give a kind of different level of kind of reality. They are either God's attributes or they're referring to God himself. And of course, they are something that he spoke in the Quran, and in that sense can go back to his speech and even to his eternal speech that he gave those meanings. But and then in its Arabic form, he thinks of this as creation because it's something that has a distinction within it, beginning and end, and so on, and it was revealed in a certain time and place. But he doesn't think that the names have this extra sort of level of reality within God. That's the way he's looking at it theologically. So it's important to be aware of that. So now I want to get into some of the names. So the first name or the pairing of names I'm going to look at are Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. So obviously in the Basmala, something that we will constantly say. So as I'm sure you know, the kind of origin word that gets associated in his tafsir is Rahmah. So from mercy. And I'm just to say as well before I get fully into it, when Al-Maturidi, when we shift from his theological lens to his tafsir lens, even though he's got a very theological way of seeing tafsir, he will kind of give more like in his theology, he's very kind of clear on exactly what he thinks the correct view is. And he will argue for what he thinks are the correct theological views. He's very precise in that way. He'll engage with various ideas, and sometimes he'll give options, but most of the time he's very kind of clear. Not always easy to understand, but he's at least arguing for something, one thing. In the tafsir, which conforms more to that genre, there's more of a kind of number of options of what he will say the case is, and he will give different opinions and different views, and so it's a bit more loose. But nonetheless, I've tried to kind of navigate that and give you what I think he's essentially saying as well for the tafsir. So when he talks about Rahmah, he talks about the Rahman and Rahim names as referring to two gentlenesses, raqiqan, but one of them is more gentle than the other. And in fact, he says it's better interpreted as two subtle kindnesses, latifan, one more subtle than the other, more altaf. So he's linking the names of Rahman and Rahim to the name Al-Latif, which is very interesting. So I will look at that name in a minute as well. And he's talking about them as being kind of, so there these two sort of subtleties to these names, in Allah's divine nature, but one is more subtle. So what does that refer to? Well, it seems that what he's saying here is that there's one of the two names between Ar-Rahman and Rahim, both meaning mercy and gentleness and kindness and so on, but one is more specific and more complete. And this is the mercy to believers, because he's Rahim bil Mu'mineen. And that's particularly in his guidance towards the deen, towards his religion. So Allah guides the believers, and that expresses a special sort of mercy that's only for the believers. So it's more specific. While the name Rahman is in a sense more general. So one does not say Rahman bil Mu'mineen. One does not say that God is Rahman or is Ar-Rahman for the believer or for the believer specifically, even though it is the case that both believers and disbelievers share in God's provision, because Ar-Rahman is about this general provision of everything. Allah gives everything in the world. Allah sustains the whole world. So this sense of God's nature, and I'll come back to the name Ar-Rahman, it has this more general sense, which means it's not just specified for the believers. And likewise, he says, conversely, one does not say Rahim bil Kafirin. It does not say that God is specifically merciful to the disbelievers, because this specific type of mercy is, other scholars will say this has been saved for the day of judgment, and it relates to, the final reckoning of paradise and hell. It's not the kind of general provision in the world. So the name Rahman now is only for God. only God can be named Rahman, because he sees this, Maturidi sees this as what he calls an essential name, Ism Dhati. So this has the meaning that the name describes God in his essential nature or essence. That is, one can actually refer to God just as Ar-Rahman. And we have this uh, in the verse 17:110. Say to them, call on God, call on Allah, or on Ar-Rahman. Whatever names you call him, the best names belong to him. This is the Asma al-Husna. So the name Ar-Rahman is, and this was actually also it was in use, I believe, in the pre-Islamic period as well, as a name, as effectively a proper name for God, even if we know that it's clearly an intensive form of this idea of Rahmah. It's actually a proper name. It's Allah's name. Ar-Rahman is a proper name, not just that He is the merciful, but that Ar-Rahman is His name, just as Allah. Um, of course, there's a famous difference of opinion in the name Allah itself. Does this refer to Al-Ilah, the God, or is it just Allah's name? And different scholars differ on these matters. Certainly, by the time of the revelation of the Quran, it had become uh, an Allah as a proper name, and Ar-Rahman seems similar. And so, um, in the Quran, Rahman is always Ar-Rahman. You don't have, as I understand, I did some checking. You don't have, um, uh, Allah described as Rahman without without it being His name. While Rahim, you do get this. In fact, more than often than not, except for the Basmala, you get Rahim you being used in this kind of adjectival way, as an active name, as what Maturidi calls it, is fairly and effectively, as I said, an attribute. And of course, as an attribute, Rahim can be possessed by a human being. So the Prophet is referred to as Ra'uf Rahim. So Rahim can be used, and this is not something shocking or strange. Of course, attributes such as ilm can be applied to, God has knowledge, we have knowledge. It's not the same knowledge. Um, you know, Allah, but it's interesting that this intensive form is actually used for special individuals like the Prophet ﷺ. Um, it's- Now, what you might see that expression used in the speech of the Arabs. But generally, I think Muslims would avoid this way of speaking. Um, Now, the fact that Maturidi says the fact that a human being cannot be called Ar-Rahman or Rahman, he argues, led to the Arabs not recognizing the name. Some of them, so some of them said, and this is his interpretation of 2560. Yet when they are told, bow down before Ar-Rahman, bow down before the Lord of Mercy, they say, what is should we you command, and they turn further away. So he actually, because it wasn't in common use amongst I guess, in their context. Perhaps elsewhere on the peninsula it might have been associated, I think, with certain areas. Okay, so this is, I think, important. So then I want to now turn to the name, a little bit more about the name Al-Latif. So Al-Latif, as we saw, was being brought up in the context of even discussing the name Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim. And so what Maturidi says about Al-Latif in his tafsir, when I looked it up, and he says it speaks about this name in a number of places. He mentions Al-Bar Al-Rahim. So we've got the good Al-Bar and Ar-Rahim again, the merciful. So so we've got uh, in a sense Al-Latif leading back to Ar-Rahim, but with this extra name Al-Barr, which we'll come on to, so the good. And also another aspect that comes out about Latif is also to do with God's knowledge. So it's to do with him being omniscient about hidden things. So when things are very subtle, very hidden, very difficult to understand, then Al-Latif is a kind of subtlety of knowledge about that. And it's associated with this kind of subtle kindness as well. So again, we've got the name referring to God's action of mercy. Al-Latif refers to God being merciful and his goodness, and also his knowledge in regards to hidden things. I've got this pairing between Al-Latif and Al-Khabir. You'll see two names come together. Al-Khabir is kind of, most informed or something like this, right? The one who is like all knowing, but in particular relating, at least according to Maturidi, to outward things. So Latif refers to that all that knowledge of inward things, of the secrets of the hearts and of the spirit, while Al Khabir would relate to an outward knowledge of, God knows everything in the world, all the things of the world. So this would be a distinction there. And I want to come on to a bit more about God's knowledge next week, inshallah. So then I want to turn to the name Al-Bar, which has also been mentioned to define Latif. Now, this is the good. Now, this is very interesting. What you will see in Islamic theology, especially when we're practicing that theology in the English language, it's important to be aware of the meanings and the connections of the words that we're using. And what we've seen is a highlighting of mercy and a highlighting of this action of mercy and various types of subtlety and knowledge and so on. You see this term good has only come in at a secondary level, not even in the definition of mercy, but only in the definition of Latif related to mercy, according to this great theologian, Al-Maturidi. Now, this is a hint for us, particularly vis-a-vis, as Muslims, vis-a-vis Christian understandings, where the goodness of God, and the understanding of God as the good and to do, all good is very prominent in the theological makeup. In Islam, it's not that God isn't good, na'udhu billah, but the focus we give is on mercy, on benevolence, on other things. As Maturidi will be stressing, and as Quran stresses, God's wisdom, and so on. And here, of course, this lutf, this latif, and so it does come up, but it's not prominent itself. Al-Bar is not prominent as a name in the Quran. And he's just using it to express this goodness of God. So what does it mean? And knowing his theology, what does it mean when we say that God is the good? Well, it refers to his creation of good, right? God, according to Al-Maturidi's theology, he is the creator of good and he's the creator of evil. But you don't call him the evil, because that is basically impermissible, a lack of adab, right? Because it's applying a bad name, a sort of blameworthy name. But there is a principle in play that when something is praiseworthy and appropriate, then it can be ascribed to God. So we can call God Al-Bar in this context because he creates the good, and we apply that which is praiseworthy to him in those respects. But he also creates evil, and as you know, in the Sunni Islam, that's not shied away from. It's very clear that God creates everything. Khayrihi wa sharrihi min Allah. So everything, the good and its evil, is created by God, but we only call him the Lord of good, and names of that appropriate way. And then this is actually at the level of what's permissible for us. So it's what's permissible for us to call him by. So it's interesting here that this name Al-Bar actually goes back to his creating, and it goes back, if anything, to his mercy treat it in that way, an action of mercy. But we don't. We there's a reluctance to bring this goodness per se into the divine nature, because to be equal, you'd be also bringing evil, and that's unacceptable. So Maturidi avoids this problem. He puts good and evil in its place and highlights these other attributes like mercy, wisdom, etc. And I think this is a very profound point when you come today to these questions of the problem of evil. You have this idea, these 3 points. God is all powerful, and He's all good, and He's all knowing, and so on. How can He, how can He not just, um, uh, how can He allow evil to even exist in the world? This is a worry that people will have, and people think, because it's a really major problem for, theology in the modern age. And of course, if you say, well, let's understand this word good, what we really mean about God is, is this term good? Is it really appropriate to God, or is that something that we have in the world? But God actually is beyond that, in that He creates both good and evil. He creates a very rich world, and he has to, because that's what wisdom is about, and that's how He manifests also His mercy. So there are bad things that God will create, and that's not something to be worried about, because the pattern of existence, the pattern of creation, needs those things for things like free will, for manifesting virtues, for struggling against adversity and going through trials, ultimately for the good to be the only thing that you're going to encounter in paradise. So this is his wisdom, is to create the world in a certain way. And with that, we will shift to next week to talk a bit more about God's omnipotence and His wisdom through these names and through the Quranic tafsir. I want to give the opportunity for you to ask any questions, and don't be shy that some question is too obvious. I mean, I won't be reading out names; I'll just be answering the questions. So please do put them in the chat if you've got questions related to this topic, or even somewhat in the same space that I would be able to answer. I'll be very happy to try to answer a few questions before we go to get ready for our iftars or other things if you're not in the UK. So yeah, please go ahead. Please drop them in the chat, and I'm going to wait and hopefully take a few questions before we break. So Jazakallah khairan for everyone who came into the session, and do support Cambridge Muslim College. We're doing great work in our various programs, from teaching to research, and continuing education and more. So do look us up if you haven't heard of the college that much before. If you know us well, we look forward to your continued engagement with us. So far I've been told that we haven't had any questions come through, which is not, I mean, this is quite heavy material in some ways, but nonetheless, it's good. The cure for not knowing something is to ask. Okay. So I've got a question coming through. Can you provide an example of how the beautiful names of Allah are invoked in Islamic prayers or supplications? Yeah, so this is you will get various ways this happens. The names, of course, may appear in various known prophetic supplications and so on. I don't have anything prepared to mind, but certainly, you can just prefix any of the names with ya, o, meaning o. So you could say Ya Latif, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim. So you can go through and call on Allah by all of His names or by any of His names. And particularly, sometimes if you had some need that was related to a particular, like difficult, maybe like it's a good example, some kind of very, you needed some very particular type of help that no one in the creation could give you this kind of help, right? You can't ask anyone else for something that only God could do. It's just to make something. Obviously everything is what God does, but some things you can ask for the creation, but some things you can't ask. A person can't help you with this matter. Some kind of special help that you need in some aspect of life that people can't help you with, then Ya Latif could refer to God in his subtlety of his knowledge and his ability to manifest that kindness in that most subtle way. So, Ya Latif could be used in that way. And in fact, it was actually in some of the kind of tariqas, they have like special sort of litanies or supplications related to Latif in that regard. So, these are the kind of things that can be brought up. They're very powerful. Allah's asked, given these so we can call on Him and be aware of Him. Someone said, what is the purpose of making a distinction between the attribute, juz'i, and the absolute, kulli, in Matthews' explanation of the names of Allah? Okay, so the point here is that some of these names will be referred to in the Quran in the indefinite form. So, Rahim, without al. Now, if you say, Kan Allahu Rahiman, for example, Allah is sort of ever merciful, then that name, that being merciful, is an attribute of God. So he possesses that mercy, that being merciful, as an attribute. While if you refer to Ar-Rahim, this is Allah. But still, even when you say Ar-Rahim, you can't call Allah Ar-Rahim unless there is a rahmah to him. That qualifies him. You couldn't call Allah something that was inappropriate with al, because it wouldn't be an aspect of his essence or nature. So the distinction here is, in some names, as we said, say you said Al-Qadim, the Eternal One, right? That's not a Quranic name, but if you said that, that would be referring, as in later kalam, you get wajibul wujud, the necessary existence. It's not a Quranic term, but but if we were to name Allah the necessary existent, then that would be about him and his complete essential nature. It wouldn't be about a particular attribute that he possesses. So the distinction is basically according to Al-Maturidi, the divine the divine nature is not God is not just a simple essence per se. God has these distinct attributes, and so these need to be accounted for, and they are accounted for, he thinks, by the verses of the Quran that give us different qualities and of God. So this is the main point of the distinction, is to say names need to refer. So just to summarize what I was going on at the beginning of the session, names need to refer. So the names either refer to, in some sense, something in creation, but when they don't just refer to creation, they go beyond creation, then they refer to God, or they refer to God's attributes. That's all there is to refer to. They're not there's not like a sort of, according to Maturidi, there's not like a sort of level of ontology, level of existence that's the names around God, or separate from the attributes. There's the attributes and there's God. And the names help us refer to one or the other. That's the way he's seeing it. Wallahu alam. Can you recommend reading a book on Allah's names to understand the depth and meaning of each of the names? So, of course, there's a famous book that's been translated by Imam al-Ghazali. So this would be, I think, the kind of go-to book for this kind of matter. So you could read, it's definitely available, and you can read about the names from Imam al-Ghazali, and he'll go into some of the details. Of course, you've got to bear in mind the particular framework that he'll bring to that. He's an Ash'ari, not a Maturidi. He's also got different other tendencies in his kind of spiritual formation and so on. So, but I'm sure it'll be very beneficial. This will be This will be where we close up. So last question for today, inshallah. Um, I want to just finish by just saying, that those who didn't catch it at the beginning, I just want to say, I'm a lecturer in Islamic studies at the Cambridge Muslim College. I'm also program lead for research. We really require the help to keep running and to really not just to keep running, but to do excellent work, to get support from the community. I think our institution does some wonderful things, and we do ask you to help contribute in any way you can, to help train future generations of scholars and leaders, thinkers, and so on. And you can also give regularly as a friend or patron, one-off donations. So you can check us out on our website, cambridgemuslimcollege.ac.uk/donate to donate, because it's Ramadan. And also just to say that Ramadan Live this year, we've got a packed program. Many of my colleagues are involved in this. So every day at 5 p.m. there's something happening in Ramadan. On Monday, we have Dr. Omar Qureshi aiming high with the objectives of the Quran. Tuesday, Salman Yunus, the spiritual dimensions of fasting and charity in the Quran. Wednesday is obviously what I'm doing with the beautiful names. Um, uh, Friday, Rani Al-Awad, finding healing through the Quran. Saturday, Suleiman Van Al, spiritual jurisprudence in the Quran. Sunday, Abdullah Rothman, knowledge of self in the Quran. And Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad has Ramadan Moments, which is not a live session, but it's released on Thursdays. So thanks for your attention today, and Allah bless you in your worship, in your fasting, in your praying, and everything that you do during this month. And I look forward to continuing the sessions next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.